Hey, and welcome to my weekly devlog for Rift Between. During the past week, I worked on adding in the foundation of a crafting system that can be expanded with new recipes fairly easily, along with an inventory system that contains multiple inventories. But before I go into talking about all of that, I actually have some really exciting news to share and what it means for the project as a whole. Over the past 2 weeks, there's actually been two very talented people join the project, an artist named Amusing and a writer named Izzinski. Amusing has been working on concept art for things, including helping draft up ideas for UI layouts that I used as a template when working on the crafting UI this week. And using this concept as a template greatly helped speed up laying out elements on the canvas. It also helped with being able to conceptualize easier in my head what would be needed to be communicated in the script for everything to function properly. And Izzinski has been drafting up some really cool ideas for the intro and story of the game, as well as challenges and overall progression. With both of them joining the project and bringing their unique set of skills, the end quality will be something that Nathan Audio and I could not achieve alone, and I look forward to being able to share more of their work in future devlogs. Back on the subject of what I had worked on for the project this week, one of the first few things was starting the foundations of the crafting system. Back when I had made the Game Jam game, it was my first time trying to script one of these, and before I knew anything about scriptable objects. And because of that, the crafting was very hard to extend with any new upgrades or unlockables. One of the goals with the crafting system this time is to have it easy to add or remove recipes as needed. So one of the first things I created for the crafting system was a new scriptable object I called Craft Card. Inside of this script, I included things like references for the sprite and strings for things like the item type and description. Once I had the scriptable objects finished, I made a few containers for objects as placeholders to be able to test the scripts. The first area of UI that made sense to work on was the crafting list, as the center area would need to be able to grab information from the items that are clicked on. When making the scroll bar, I ended up having to mess around for a while to figure out why it would always rebound back to the start of the scroll when I would let it go. This ended up being a drop down on the scroll bar under navigation. Once I set this to none, the rebound stopped and I can move the slider up and down properly. Now that the scrolling list was working, I needed to make the script for the crafting recipes that go inside. Inside of the script, I put a reference to the craft card and a few variables for the item name and image. Inside of start, I set the image of the container to use the craft card, as well as its name, and then it runs through a fairly large wall of if statements about the cost of the resources needed to craft the item. Inside of this if statement, it checks for each type of resource that the recipe can use, and if the bool is set true for that resource. If it is, it'll spawn in a resource prefab. This prefab is just a game object with an image and text, and then the statement will set the image and text of this new game object to be the resource, and the cost of the resource based on the craft card. The final thing in the script is a function that is ran when the recipe is clicked. This function is actually on another script attached to the center area of the crafting UI. The function it goes to on this new script has a few inputs that are fed from that current script as reference, though now I can see that I could just use the passed-in crafting card for almost all those things. This function also checks if the recipe being clicked on is available to the player or not, and if it's not, it changes everything to question marks or removes some of the items entirely. Once the script is done setting up the card, it runs two more functions. One for setting up the resource cost of each object, and another for setting up how much the max is allowed to be crafted of the item. Up until now, the hotbars in the game were really simple if statements for spawning in only one object, and were not actually set up to be able to add things like stacks of items. I tried to brainstorm a few ways I could tackle this, but in the end I felt there was no solution I could think of that would work really well with my current knowledge. So I spent some time browsing YouTube tutorials trying to find one that would help steer me in a good direction. I ended up using a series by BMO to get the very basics in, and in the process I learned about delegates and calling action events. Once I had a basic hotbar working, I extended it out to use some of the features we have been brainstorming. One of those is that we want the player's inventory to start at 20 slots and be upgradable, as well as a 10-slot hotbar and the player having access to the inventory while crafting. Since all three of these are using the same list and dictionary, there would be a way to do this with only one inventory that scales each time the action is called. But instead I chose to actually use 3 separate inventories that all update at the same time with the same calls as each other. This was a fairly easy way to get it working. I don't really know if refreshing 3 inventories when an item is grabbed will be a huge performance hit in the end yet or not, but I'll probably need to brainstorm other ways to do the same thing down the line. After I had all the inventories communicating, I added one last thing for the week. It's a temporary game object for the crafting station, so I could add in interacting with an object to bring up the menu. And with all this in place, the project now has a very scalable crafting system that goes along with an easy to scale inventory that both rely on scriptable objects for most of their information. This has been a really fun week seeing a few of the larger systems needed for the game come together, and the next thing I want to tackle is the actual crafting of items, and having them sent to the inventory as usable placeholder objects. That's the end of the log for this week, so until next week, take care.